The winter evening had settled deeply across the Arizona land, covering the open fields and distant hills with a thin layer of silver frost. The sky was already turning dark, and the cold felt sharper than usual. Thomas Hale, a quiet rancher who lived alone on the far side of the settlement, finished locking the barn door and pulled his coat closer around his shoulders. He could see his breath in the air, and even the animals seemed restless from the cold. Nights like this were always silent. No visitors, no travelers, no one passing by his small cabin. The road was too empty, and the weather too hard. Inside, Thomas moved slowly, warming his hands near the stove, preparing a simple supper for himself. He planned to eat, read a few pages of an old book, and go to sleep early. Winter days were long and lonely, and he had lived this way for many years. He was used to the quiet. He had accepted it. Or maybe the quiet had accepted him. But just as he sat down at the table, a sound broke through the stillness, a soft, careful knock on his door. It was so gentle that at first he wasn't even sure he heard it. He froze and listened again. Another knock came, a little stronger this time, but still hesitant, almost scared. Thomas stood up slowly. Visitors were rare in this part of the land, especially after sunset. He felt a mix of curiosity and caution as he stepped toward the door. When he opened it, the cold rushed inside like a wave, along with something he never expected to see. There, on the small wooden porch, stood a young Apache girl. She looked no older than 16. Her clothes were thin, her hair was messy from the wind, and her small bare feet were red from the cold. She shivered from head to toe. Her eyes carried both fear and hope, like someone unsure whether to run or ask for help. Before Thomas could say anything, she spoke in a soft voice, shaking slightly from the cold. "Please, let me stay with you tonight," she said. "I'll help you put the log in the stove." Her words were simple, almost whispered, but they carried a deep sense of need. She wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't asking to stay forever, just one night, just shelter, just warmth. For a few moments, Thomas didn't know what to say. He looked at her, studying the worry on her face and the way she clutched her arms around herself. The wind pushed against her thin clothing, and he realized she had probably been outside for a long time. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze," he said gently. The girl hesitated, as if unsure whether she was truly welcome. But after a small pause, she walked inside. Thomas closed the door behind her to keep the cold out. She stood near the entrance, not moving too far in, almost like she was afraid to take up space she didn't deserve. "What's your name?" Thomas asked calmly. She lifted her eyes slightly. "Nalin," she answered. A pretty name, he thought. Soft and peaceful. Thomas noticed how she continued shivering. He motioned toward the stove. "Go closer to the fire. Warm yourself." Nalin stepped forward slowly, as if making sure each step was allowed. She held out her hands near the stove, rubbing them together. The warmth touched her face, and her shoulders relaxed a little. Even so, she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. Thomas watched her quietly. She looked frightened, but not dangerous, just tired, cold, and alone. For a man who had lived by himself for years, seeing someone this young in such a fragile condition stirred something inside him, a mix of worry and responsibility. "Where are your shoes?" he asked gently. She looked down, embarrassed. "I lost them in the snow," she said softly. "The wind was strong. I tried to find the path, but it disappeared." Her voice trembled. Not from cold now, but from remembering how lost she had been. Thomas nodded slowly. "You must have walked a long way to reach here." Nalin did not speak for a moment. Then she nodded. He didn't pressure her with more questions. Instead, He moved to the kitchen, grabbed an extra blanket from the shelf, and returned. "Here," he said. "Wrap this around you." She accepted it cautiously, her fingers brushing the fabric with gratitude. As she covered herself in the thick blanket, her face softened. It was perhaps the first warmth she had felt all day. "Would you like something to eat?" Thomas offered. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded again. He placed a bowl of warm stew on the table. She waited for a signal, unsure if she should sit. When Thomas gestured to the chair, she sat down carefully, as if she feared disturbing anything in the small cabin. She ate quietly at first, then with a hunger she tried to hide. Thomas sat across from her, watching with thoughtful eyes. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions, but he also felt he needed to understand at least a little of her situation. "How did you end up this far from your people?" he asked gently. Nalin lowered her spoon and took a moment to answer. "The storm came fast," she said. "My group moved ahead. I looked for them, but the snow made everything disappear. I walked and walked, and then I saw your house." Her explanation was simple, but the sadness behind her words was unmistakable. Being separated from her group must have been frightening, and wandering alone in the cold, even more so. Thomas nodded again. He didn't want her to feel interrogated or judged. He knew that the world outside could be difficult, and sometimes people simply needed help. "You're safe here," he said kindly. "No harm will come to you tonight." Nalin looked at him with careful eyes, as if weighing his words. Trust did not come easy to her, he could see that clearly. She had likely seen many harsh moments in her short life, enough to make her cautious of strangers. But the fire was warm, the food was filling, and Thomas's voice carried no anger, no impatience. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed a little more. She looked around the cabin, as if studying every detail to understand what kind of man lived here. The walls were simple but clean. Tools were neatly hung. Books were stacked in the corner. A handmade rug lay near the bed. Everything spoke of a quiet life, an honest one. After finishing her meal, Nalin stood up suddenly. Thomas looked at her with a small surprise. She pointed toward the woodpile near the stove. "I said I would help," she said softly. Thomas almost smiled. Even in her tired state, she wanted to keep her promise. "You don't have to do that tonight," he replied. "You need rest." But she shook her head, picked up a small piece of wood and carefully placed it in the stove. The fire brightened. She stepped back and watched it grow, as if finding comfort in the gentle flames. Seeing her effort made Thomas's heart soften. He had spent many years living alone, and small acts like this, simple kindness, honest work, felt strangely meaningful when shared with someone else. As the night grew colder outside and the wind began to howl again, the cabin felt warmer than it had in a long time. Nalin stayed near the fire, her eyes slowly closing from exhaustion. Thomas brought another blanket and placed it on the empty side of the room. "You can sleep there," he said. "It's warm and safe." She nodded sleepily, wrapped the blanket around herself again, and lay down on the soft rug. Within minutes, her breathing became steady, peaceful. For the first time that night, she looked calm. Thomas watched her for a moment, then returned to his chair. The cabin was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel lonely. There was something new in the air, something gentle, something unexpected. A young girl had arrived at his door, frightened and cold, and now she rested safely under his roof. As the fire crackled softly and the night deepened, Thomas realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes life sends someone to your door, not by accident, but because you are meant to help them. And tonight, that someone was Nalin. The morning light entered the cabin slowly, brushing the wooden floor with a pale golden glow. Thomas Hale opened his eyes to the familiar creak of the wind outside. But this morning felt different somehow. He remembered the unexpected knock from the night before, the quiet voice at his door, the shivering Apache girl asking for shelter. He turned his head and saw her still asleep on the rug near the stove, wrapped in the blankets he had given her. She looked peaceful, almost like a little bird resting after a long flight. Her breathing was soft and steady, and her face seemed calmer than it had the night before. The fire in the stove had burned low, but the room still held a soft warmth. Thomas stood quietly, not wanting to wake her. He moved around the cabin as gently as he could, placing more wood in the stove, heating water, and preparing breakfast. As he worked, he kept glancing toward her with a sense of responsibility he had not expected to feel. He lived alone, and his life rarely changed. But now someone depended on him, even if just for a short time. After a while, Nayland began to stir. She blinked slowly, stretching her cold, stiffened hands out of the blanket. When she opened her eyes fully and saw Thomas moving near the stove, she sat up quickly, as though remembering where she was. "You're awake," Thomas said with a small smile. "Did you sleep well?" Nayland nodded, though shyly. "Yes," she answered softly. She pulled the blanket closer around herself as she stood up, still unsure of how she should act in the presence of a stranger. Her movements were careful, polite, almost too careful for someone her age. Thomas motioned toward the table. "I made breakfast. You're welcome to join me." She hesitated for a moment before walking to the table. She waited until Thomas sat down before she took her seat. He noticed that even in small things, like sitting, walking, or eating, she always watched him first, trying to understand what was allowed. Her quiet nature made the cabin feel calmer, as if the morning carried a soft whisper instead of silence. He placed a warm bowl in front of her. "I hope you like it," he said. "It's simple, but it'll warm you." She took a small bite, and her eyes brightened almost instantly. "It is good," she said, her voice clearer than the night before. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't often he cooked for anyone but himself, and seeing someone enjoy the meal filled him with a gentle warmth he hadn't felt in years. After they finished eating, Nayland stood and began collecting the dishes without being asked. Thomas watched her with mild surprise. "You don't have to do that," he said. She glanced at him, her eyes uncertain. "I said I would help," she reminded him softly. There was honesty in her words, far bigger than her small frame. She wanted to prove something, not just gratitude, but that she wasn't a burden. Thomas respected that, so he let her rinse the bowls while he dried them. As they cleaned, he asked quietly, "Do you know where your group might be now?" Nayland paused, thinking. "Maybe far," she said. "Maybe close. I don't know now." The sadness in her voice returned, but it wasn't the heavy sadness of fear. It was more like missing something familiar, her people, her safety, her home. Thomas understood the feeling more than she could know. He had lost his wife years earlier, and ever since, his cabin had been filled only with silence. Loneliness was something he carried like an invisible weight. Seeing someone else feel lost stirred an old ache in him. "We'll figure something out," he assured her gently. "You don't have to worry right now." Nayland nodded, though her eyes remained thoughtful. When they finished cleaning, Thomas stepped outside to check the land. The air was crisp, but not as cold as the night before. Fresh snow sparkled like tiny crystals on the ground. The tracks from the storm were mostly covered now, but the landscape still felt quiet, almost too quiet. Nayland followed him outside, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the land curiously, as if studying every tree, every distant hill, every cloud. "Are you feeling warmer today?" Thomas asked. "Yes," she replied. "Much better." He pointed to the woodpile near the side of the cabin. I'll need to restock the stove wood for the day, he said. You can rest inside if you want. But Nalin shook her head. I can help. Thomas paused. She truly meant it. She wasn't just being polite. Helping made her feel useful, safe, and part of something. All right, he said. But don't strain yourself. You're still tired. Together they worked by the woodpile. Thomas chopped the larger pieces into smaller ones, and Nalin carried and stacked them. She was careful, but stronger than she looked. Her steps were quiet, her movements light, and she carried each piece of wood as though it were something precious. While they worked, Thomas tried to ask gentle questions, not to invade her privacy, but to understand her better. Do you live near the mountains? He asked. She nodded. My people move where food and water are good. Sometimes mountains, sometimes the river area. And you were traveling with them during the storm? Yes, she answered. Storm came fast. Snow fell heavy. Everything looked the same. I walked for a long time. Then I saw your home. Her voice softened again at the memory. Thomas felt a knot in his chest. She must have been wandering alone for hours in the freezing wind. After an hour of work, they had built a generous stack of wood. Thomas brushed the remaining bark from his hands and glanced at her. You've done enough. You should rest now. She looked at him with a tiny smile, small but genuine. I like helping, she said. It keeps my mind calm. Thomas nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. Work had always been his way of keeping his own thoughts steady. They returned to the cabin, where the warmth from the stove felt like a soft blanket. Nalin sat near the fire again, humming a quiet melody under her breath. Thomas listened carefully. It was gentle, smooth, and comforting, something like a lullaby. It filled the cabin with a peaceful sound that felt almost magical. That song, Thomas said. Is it from your family? Nalin nodded. My mother sang it every night, she said. She said it keeps the heart warm. Thomas felt the words sink deep inside him. He could picture a small girl curled next to her mother, hearing the same soft tune each night. A mother's voice, a warm fire, a sense of safety. How long had it been since Nalin felt that kind of comfort? You sing beautifully, he said gently. Nalin lowered her eyes shyly. It helps me not feel alone. Her honesty touched him more than she knew. You're not alone today, Thomas said softly. She looked at him, a long, searching look, as if trying to see whether she could believe that. After a moment, she gave a small nod. As the day moved forward, Nalin helped around the cabin in small ways, sweeping the floor, folding blankets, organizing tools. She asked permission each time, but Thomas kept reminding her that she was free to rest. Still, she wanted to help. It made her feel grounded. The storm had passed, but the cold outside remained strong. Later in the afternoon, Thomas brewed warm tea, and they sat together near the stove. He read from a book while Nalin listened, even though she didn't understand every word. She liked the sound of his voice, calm, steady, and patient. For Thomas, the cabin felt strangely alive. Someone sitting across from him, someone humming softly, someone offering help. It was a change he had not expected, and yet it felt strangely natural. Before evening fell, Nalin looked at him with quiet worry. Will the storm come again? Maybe some snow, Thomas answered, but not like yesterday. You'll be safe here. Her shoulders relaxed at his words. Trust, slow and careful, was beginning to grow between them. As night approached, the cabin glowed with the soft light of the stove. Nalin wrapped herself in a blanket once more, settling near the fire. Thomas sat close by, quietly carving a small piece of wood, a hobby he used to pass the time. The day had passed peacefully, gently, with no fear and no hurry. Two people from different worlds, sharing warmth, silence, and small moments of understanding. Thomas looked at her sleeping face as the night deepened. And he realized something. Sometimes trust doesn't arrive with loud words or grand actions. Sometimes it comes in quiet steps, like a young girl offering to help carry firewood. The morning started peacefully, just like the one before it. A soft, calm light filled the cabin as Thomas added more wood to the stove. The air smelled warm, earthy, and safe. Nalin was already awake, sitting quietly on the rug with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched the fire with thoughtful eyes, as if thinking deeply about something she couldn't quite say. Thomas greeted her with a gentle nod. "Good morning?" She returned the greeting softly. "Good morning." Together they shared breakfast, and though their words were few, the silence between them felt warm, comfortable, not empty. For a moment, it seemed as though this unusual arrangement could go on smoothly for another day or two. But fate had its own timing, and that peaceful early morning glow did not last long. Thomas stepped outside to check the weather and see if the land needed anything. The sky was clear, and the air felt cold but steady. Snow still covered the ground in thin patches, sparkling in the sunlight. He walked around the cabin, stretching his muscles from the night's rest. Everything looked normal at first, but then something caught his eye. There, pressed lightly into the snow, were fresh horse tracks. Not old, not faint. Fresh, made only a short while ago. Thomas knelt down, brushing the snow with his fingertips. The tracks were deep enough to show that there had been at least 3 horses. The thought made his stomach tighten. This wasn't the common path that travelers used, and visitors rarely appeared this far away from the settlement. Whoever came here this morning wasn't simply passing by. He stood slowly, scanning the quiet land around him. The tracks led toward his cabin and then curved away toward the trees. Someone had ridden close enough to look at his home but had not stopped. That alone was strange. When he went back inside, Nalin looked at him immediately. She sensed something different in the way he closed the door, more carefully, more slowly, as though he didn't want the sound to echo. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, not wanting to trouble her too quickly. "There were horse tracks outside," he said. "Fresh ones." Nalin's eyes widened in a way he had never seen before, not wide with simple surprise, but with a deep, quiet worry. She stood up slowly. "Were they many tracks?" "3, maybe 4, Thomas said. "You know something about them?" Nalin didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step back, her hands gripping the blanket around her. She looked toward the door, then at the small window, then back at Thomas. Her breathing grew unsteady. I think they are the men who were following me," she whispered at last. Thomas felt a stir of concern. "Following you?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yesterday, before the storm came, I saw them first." She paused, trying to find simple words to explain something she feared but did not want to remember. "They were riding fast. I hid behind rocks and trees. I walked far. I thought I lost them in the snow." Her voice grew quiet, almost like she was speaking to herself. "I hoped they were gone." Thomas approached her slowly, not in a way that would scare her, but in a steady, reassuring manner. "You're safe here," he said calmly. "They don't know you're inside. They didn't knock. They didn't look for you directly." But Nalin still looked frightened. She shook her head. "They came close," she said. "If they come again, they will look around." Thomas understood the meaning behind her words. She wasn't afraid of anything extreme. She was simply afraid of being taken away from safety. Perhaps the men who had been following her were just riders, but from her expression it was clear she didn't trust them. Something about them had made her feel unsafe the day before, and her instinct was to hide. He took a slow breath and nodded. "We'll be careful," he said gently. "I won't let anyone trouble you." Nolan's eyes softened, but her worry didn't disappear completely. She walked toward the small window and peeked outside, her fingers gripping the edge of the frame. Her expression was thoughtful. She seemed to be studying the land, the trees, the direction from where the riders had come. The way she moved reminded Thomas of a deer listening for distant sounds, sensitive to every little thing. They spent the morning quietly, both of them alert. Thomas tried to keep things normal, chopping wood, fixing tools, preparing lunch. Nolan stayed inside, occasionally peeking outside, but mostly sitting near the fire. While they ate, Thomas tried to calm her with gentle conversation. "You told me yesterday that you separated from your group during the storm," he said softly. "Did these men ride near your group?" Nolan looked down at her bowl for a long moment before answering. "Yes, they were far, but my people saw them sometimes on the paths. They didn't talk to us. They just watched." Her expression grew troubled again. "I think they were looking for something, or someone." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sometimes people ride through the land for supplies or searching for missing animals. It might not be about you." She thought about that, then nodded, though she still seemed unsure. Her worry came not from the men themselves, but from the memory of being alone in the cold, seeing them in the distance, and feeling exposed. After lunch, Thomas stepped out again to check if there were new tracks. The snow had not fallen since morning, so the ground revealed everything clearly. He didn't see new prints, but the earlier tracks remained, their pattern unmistakable. Nolan came to stand beside him at the door, staring quietly at the ground. "They were close," she whispered. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "but they didn't come inside. And if they return, I'll be here." She looked at him with a softness that carried trust, a trust that had grown slowly but strongly since the night she arrived. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas felt something warm at her words, a feeling that reached deeper than he expected. He nodded. "You don't have to thank me. You're not alone anymore." Nolan stepped back inside, her posture more relaxed. She began humming her gentle tune again, the same one she had hummed the day before. The melody filled the cabin with warmth, chasing away the silence that might have otherwise felt tense. Thomas listened while he worked. Her presence made the space feel less empty, even during moments of quiet. As the day went on, the wind picked up again. The sky grew slightly cloudy, and by late afternoon, the land looked pale and still. Thomas kept checking the window, not with fear, but with careful attention. He didn't want anything to catch him by surprise. Just before evening, while he was bringing in more firewood, he noticed something else. The riders' tracks leading into the trees were faint, but they continued farther than he had thought. Whoever they were, they had been circling the area, not simply riding past. He returned inside and closed the door firmly. Nolan looked at him immediately, sensing something in his expression. "They're still in the area," he said quietly. "The tracks show they didn't ride far." Nolan's worry returned for a moment, but Thomas raised his hand gently. "We'll be fine," he assured her. "We'll stay inside tonight. I'll keep the lanterns low and the door locked. You don't need to be afraid." She breathed out slowly, trying to calm herself. "You are kind," she said softly. "I do not want trouble to come to your home because of me." Thomas shook his head. "You didn't bring trouble. You only needed help. Anyone would help someone in need." Nolan looked at him thoughtfully, a small warmth glowing in her eyes. She seemed relieved, not just because he offered safety, but because he didn't blame her for anything. Night fell slowly, wrapping the cabin in a soft, quiet darkness. The wind whispered outside, brushing against the windows. Inside, the stove glowed a warm orange, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Nalin sat near the fire again, her blanket around her shoulders. Thomas carved a piece of wood beside her, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the room in a steady pattern. Though both of them stayed alert, the fear that had touched the morning had softened with the warmth of the evening. Before she fell asleep, Nalin looked at Thomas one more time. "If they come again," she said softly, "I will hide." Thomas nodded. "I'll make sure you stay safe." She lay down, the firelight dancing softly across her face, and slowly drifted into sleep. Thomas remained awake a little longer, keeping watch through the quiet night. The tracks outside, the worry in Nalin's eyes, the strange riders, everything made him more aware than usual. But he wasn't afraid. Instead, he felt a strong sense of purpose, as if protecting her wasn't a burden but something he was meant to do. As the stove crackled gently and the land outside fell silent, Thomas made a quiet promise in his heart. He would keep her safe, no matter what tomorrow brought. The next morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly. A soft gray light filled the cabin as Thomas stepped out of bed. The night had passed without trouble, but he knew that a calm night didn't always mean a calm day. He added more wood to the stove and listened to the gentle crackling sound. It filled the room with warmth, wrapping everything in a peaceful glow. Nalin woke soon after, stretching her small hands toward the heat. She looked better than the day before, less worried, more rested. But Thomas could still see a shadow of concern in her eyes. A person who had traveled alone through cold land would not forget that fear so quickly. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," Thomas replied. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," she answered, though her voice carried a quiet uncertainty. They shared breakfast, and Thomas tried to keep the conversation light. He spoke about the weather, about how the sun might warm the land a little, about how the animals in the barn seemed restless before sunrise. Nalin listened carefully, nodding occasionally, though her mind seemed far away. After they finished eating, Thomas stepped outside to check the road and the trees. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked gently under his boots. The air smelled like winter, still, crisp, and untouched. But what caught his attention again were the tracks. Though faint, he could tell someone had passed by after dark. He returned inside, brushing the cold from his coat. Nalin looked up at him, reading his expression instantly. "They came again?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Thomas answered honestly. "But they didn't stop. They didn't knock. They just passed by." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful, as if she were counting how many hours she had before the riders came too close. To ease her mind, Thomas tried to keep the day busy. He showed her how to mend the small tear in a wool blanket. He explained how the old clock worked and how to wind it gently. Nalin listened carefully to everything he said. She liked learning. Each new skill made her feel steadier, more in control of her surroundings. In return, she taught Thomas a few words in her language. She pointed at the fire and said a soft word. She pointed at the sky and said another. Her voice was gentle and melodic, making simple words sound beautiful. Thomas repeated each one with a smile, sometimes saying them wrong, making her laugh quietly. Those moments brought a strange kind of peace, two people from different worlds teaching each other in the warmth of a small cabin. But even during these calm moments, both of them remained alert. Every time the wind rustled the trees or a distant noise echoed across the land, Nalin's head turned quickly. She listened carefully, her eyes full of question. Around midday, Thomas noticed her standing by the window, staring toward the trees with a look of deep thought. He walked over to her. "What is it?" he asked softly. "I think they will come back again," she whispered. I feel it. Her voice wasn't frightened, only certain, an instinct she trusted. Thomas had learned in the last 2 days that Nalin paid attention to the smallest things he sometimes missed. He placed a comforting hand on the back of the chair nearest to her. If they come, we'll be ready. She turned toward him, searching his face carefully. Ready how? We'll make sure you have a place to stay hidden, he said. Somewhere quiet, safe, and away from the door. She nodded slowly. Yes, I think that is good. Thomas spent the afternoon preparing the small root cellar below the cabin. It wasn't large, but it was warm enough and hidden well beneath a wooden trapdoor. He cleaned it, placed a blanket inside, and made sure she had a small lantern if she ever needed light. Nalin watched him work, her expression full of quiet gratitude. She didn't say much, but her eyes said more than words could. You made it very safe, she said softly once he finished. It's just in case, Thomas replied. Maybe you won't need it. But inside, he wondered if she would. Evening settled gently, painting the sky in soft pink and orange shades. Thomas and Nalin sat near the stove sharing warm tea. Nalin's humming returned, soft, steady, calming. It filled the room like a warm blanket. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tune wash over him. You sing very well, he said quietly. Nalin looked down shyly. I sing when I feel calm, she said. My mother used to say music makes the heart strong. Thomas smiled. Your mother was very wise. Nalin nodded slowly. Her thoughts drifted for a moment, and he could see a quiet sadness touch her features. But she didn't speak about it. Instead, she hummed again, this time even softer. The peaceful moment didn't last long. Just before sunset fully faded, Thomas heard something outside, a soft crunch in the snow, too steady to be the wind. His head lifted suddenly. Nalin noticed immediately and stopped humming. What is it? She whispered. Thomas stood and walked to the window very carefully. He peeked through the curtain and saw them. 4 riders, not close to the cabin, but close enough to see. They were moving slowly, scanning the area with the quiet patience of travelers looking for something familiar. Their horses made soft sounds in the snow. They did not stop, but they circled near the trees in a way that made Thomas's heart tighten. He turned to Nalin, who was already standing, her blanket clutched around her shoulders. They are back, she whispered. Thomas nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the room felt heavier, as though the riders brought a cloud of tension with them. Thomas could see Nalin's breathing grow quicker, though she tried to stay calm. It's all right, he said gently. We'll go to the cellar for a little while, just until they leave. Nalin hesitated for a moment, as if unsure if she should hide again. But when she looked out the window and saw the riders passing slowly along the edge of the land, her decision was clear. Yes, she whispered. I will go. Thomas lifted the trapdoor quietly. Nalin stepped inside, holding the lantern he had prepared for her. She turned back toward him. You will be safe too? She asked, her voice full of honest concern. Thomas smiled lightly. Of course, I'll stay here and pretend everything is normal. She nodded and stepped inside. Before lowering the trapdoor, Thomas whispered, I'll come get you when they leave. Nalin gave a small nod, trusting him fully now. Thomas closed the trapdoor gently and covered it with a rug, just as he had planned. He then dimmed the lanterns, making the cabin look calm and undisturbed. He moved to his chair, picking up the wood carving he had been working on earlier. He pretended to focus on it, though his ears were sharp and alert. Outside, the riders moved slowly, their shapes crossing the fading light. They did not come close to the cabin this time, but they stayed longer than before. Thomas listened to the quiet rhythm of their horses, the soft crunching of snow, the long moments of stillness. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds grew faint, then fainter, then gone. Still, Thomas waited a little longer, making sure the quiet had truly returned before he rose from his chair. He lifted the rug slowly and opened the trap door. "Nalin," he whispered softly. "It's safe now." She climbed out carefully, her eyes filled with relief. When she stood, she wrapped her blanket around herself and looked toward the window again, making sure. "They were close," she said quietly. "Yes," Thomas replied. "But you were safe. That's what matters." Nalin breathed out slowly and looked around the cabin, grateful to be out in the open again. Thomas noticed how her shoulders relaxed, little by little. "Tomorrow," he said gently, "we can think about a way to get you back to your people. You shouldn't stay frightened here." She nodded slowly. "Yes, I wish to go home, but I do not know the way well." "I'll help you," Thomas said simply. "We'll find a path." Nalin looked at him with eyes full of trust, fuller than before. "You have helped me so much," she whispered. "I will not forget." Thomas felt something warm settle in his chest. In 2 days, this small girl had changed the quiet rhythm of his life in a way he had never expected. Protecting her felt meaningful, natural even. The night grew deeper. They sat near the stove again, letting the fire warm their hands and calm their hearts. Outside, the land slept under the soft blanket of snow, and inside, a gentle sense of hope began to grow. Nalin hummed her soft melody again, peaceful and steady, and Thomas listened with a heart that felt strangely full. Tomorrow would bring decisions, but tonight they were safe, together, and ready for whatever the next day might bring. The next morning arrived with a soft, pale light that spread slowly across the snowy land. The world outside looked peaceful, as if the night before had never held a single worry. Thin sunlight sparkled over the untouched fields, and a quiet calm settled around the cabin. Thomas stood at the window for a long moment, studying the sky. The day looked clear, perhaps even welcoming, something he had hoped for. Behind him, Nalin stirred from her sleep. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes with her small hands. "Is it morning?" she asked in a sleepy voice. "Yes," Thomas replied gently. "It's a good day." Nalin wrapped the blanket around herself and walked toward the stove, warming her hands. She seemed calmer than the last 2 days, but Thomas could still sense a soft weight in her heart, a longing that had grown stronger each day. She missed her people. She missed the familiar sights and sounds of her own world. After breakfast, Thomas sat down at the table and looked at her with thoughtful eyes. "Nalin," he said softly, "I think today is the day we start finding your way home." Her eyes lifted slowly. For a moment she looked surprised, then hopeful, then a little nervous. You will help me?" she asked, her voice soft and filled with gratitude. Thomas nodded. "Of course. I told you. I won't let you find your way alone." A small smile appeared on her face, one of the biggest she had shown since arriving. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I am ready." But Thomas didn't miss the way she held the blanket just a little tighter, or the way her eyes drifted toward the window. Leaving a place where she had felt safe, even for a short time, took courage. They spent the first part of the morning preparing for the journey. Thomas packed food, a warm cloak, extra gloves, and a small lantern. He also filled a canteen with clean water and wrapped a scarf around Nalin's neck to keep the cold from biting her skin. "You'll need good shoes," Thomas said with a gentle smile. He brought out a pair of winter boots he rarely used. They were a little big, but warm and sturdy. Nalin slipped her feet into them slowly. They are warm, she whispered, clearly amazed. I never had shoes like this. Then they're yours now? Thomas said kindly. Her eyes softened with gratitude. Before they left, Thomas stepped outside to check the land one more time. He scanned the snow carefully. No fresh horse tracks, no distant movement. The road looked peaceful, safe. When he returned inside, he nodded to Nalin. It's a good time to leave. She took a quiet breath and followed him toward the door. Before stepping out, she paused and looked around the cabin, at the stove, the wooden table, the small rug by the bed. She had spent only 2 nights here, yet it felt familiar to her, as if warmth and kindness had soaked into every corner. This place is very kind, she whispered, almost to herself. Thomas looked at her softly. It was quiet before you came, he said. Now it feels like it carries a memory. Nalin didn't fully understand his words, but she felt the emotion behind them. She gave a small nod and stepped outside with him. The cold air touched their faces gently, not harshly like before. They walked across the open field, leaving behind a trail of footprints in the snow. The land stretched wide and silent. But today it didn't feel threatening. It felt like a path, one that would lead her home. Thomas led the way toward the direction he believed her people might be. He had traveled these lands for years and knew where the boundary of the Apache territory began. He didn't want to go too far inside, out of respect, but he wanted to take her close enough so she could be found easily. As they walked, Nalin stayed close beside him. Sometimes she looked at the sky, sometimes at the distant mountains, sometimes at the trees that lined the horizon. With every step, her confidence grew a little. After a while, she spoke softly. When I left my people, I felt alone, she said. The storm was cold. The land was big. I thought I would not find anyone. Thomas listened quietly. But then, Nalin continued, your home had warm light. I felt safe when I saw it. She paused, her voice gentle. I am glad I knocked on your door. Thomas felt her words settle deeply in his heart. I'm glad you did too, he said. They walked for nearly an hour, following a narrow path that curved between trees and small hills. Birds flew overhead, and the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots made a steady rhythm. It was peaceful, strangely peaceful for 2 people walking toward an unknown moment. Eventually, Thomas raised his hand and stopped. We're close, he said quietly. Very close. Nalin looked around with wide eyes. The land here looked familiar to her. The trees had shapes she remembered. The wind carried a scent she knew. Pine, earth, something warm and distant. This is near my people's land, she whispered. Thomas nodded. I won't go farther, but someone will find you soon. Nalin looked at him with a mix of relief and sadness. Not the painful kind, just the soft ache of goodbyes that come sooner than expected. She stepped a little closer. You helped me when I was cold. You gave me food. You gave me safety. She paused, her eyes shining. You gave me kindness. I will never forget. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. And you gave me company, he said softly. Something my home hasn't had in a long time. Nalin reached into the small pouch at her side. She brought out a tiny woven object, a talisman made of thin, braided strands, decorated with small beads. She held it out to him with both hands. This is for you, she said. My mother made it. It is for protection and peace. Thomas accepted it gently, almost reverently. The small object felt warm in his hands, filled with meaning greater than its size. Thank you, he whispered. I'll keep it always. Just then, distant figures appeared on the horizon. Not riders searching, but scouts moving with calm steps, their presence confident and peaceful. Nalin recognized them immediately. Her face lit up with relief. They are my people, she said, her voice full of hope. "They are looking for me." Thomas felt a quiet joy settle in his chest. "Then you're home." She took a few steps forward but stopped suddenly. She turned back to him with a look that held many emotions: gratitude, warmth, trust. "I will always remember you," she said softly. "The man who opened the door on a cold night." Thomas nodded, his voice gentle. "And I will remember the brave girl who made my home feel alive again." Nalin smiled, a pure, heartfelt smile that carried the warmth of everything she had experienced in his care. Then she walked toward her people, her steps light and sure. Thomas watched as the scouts met her with open arms and guided her back toward their land. As they walked away, Nalin looked back one last time and waved. Thomas lifted his hand in return. When she disappeared into the distance, Thomas stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. The land felt different now. Not empty, not silent, just calm, as though it held a gentle memory. He walked back to his cabin, the talisman held safely in his hand. When he reached the door, he looked inside. Everything was just as it had been, but it felt changed, touched by kindness, trust, and a story he would never forget. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Life returned to its quiet rhythm. But every now and then, when the wind blew softly across the fields, Thomas heard something faint, a gentle humming, a melody like Nalin's lullaby carried on the breeze. And each time he smiled quietly, feeling the warmth of that winter night all over again. Sometimes people come into our lives for only a short time, but their memory stays with us forever.